No one in that German town expected what General George S. Patton would do next. Not the soldiers, not the civilians, not even his own officers. Because when Patton discovered the first concentration camp his troops encountered, he didn't just react. He made a decision that would leave an entire town shaken, and would become one of the most controversial moments of his command. But to understand why, you have to see what he saw. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end, at least on paper. Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany. Resistance was collapsing. Entire towns were surrendering without a fight. Patton's Third Army was moving fast, almost too fast. Known for his aggressive tactics and relentless drive, Patton believed in momentum. Keep moving, keep pressure, don't give the enemy time to think. But something strange started happening as they advanced. Soldiers began reporting things that didn't fit the pattern of a crumbling army. Barbed wire fences in the middle of nowhere. Guard towers, abandoned. Railway cars that didn't carry supplies, but something far more disturbing. At first, it didn't make sense. And then, they reached a place called Ordruff. It didn't look like a battlefield. It didn't look like anything they had trained for. There were no trenches, no artillery positions, no clear signs of a fight. Instead, there was silence. An unnatural kind of silence. Patton wasn't even supposed to be there at first. This wasn't a strategic objective. It wasn't on any priority list. But reports kept coming in. Something wasn't right. So he went to see it himself. And what he found changed everything. The gates stood open when they arrived. No resistance. No guards. Just a heavy stillness in the air. Patton walked in with a small group. Officers, aides, and soldiers who had seen combat across Europe. Men who thought they understood war. But this wasn't war. Not in any way they recognized. The camp had been hastily abandoned. Whoever had been running it left in a hurry. But they hadn't taken everything with them. There were signs. Everywhere. Structures that didn't make sense at first glance. Tools that suggested forced labor. Personal belongings. Scattered. Discarded. Forgotten. And then there were the people. Survivors. Weak. Silent. Watching. Not cheering. Not celebrating. Just watching. As if they weren't sure this was real. Patton moved slowly through the camp. His usual confidence replaced by something quieter. Something heavier. He wasn't known for hesitation. But here he paused. Again and again. Taking it in. Trying to understand. Officers around him began to document what they saw. Photos. Notes. Reports. Because even in that moment, there was a realization. This had to be recorded. People wouldn't believe it otherwise. And that's when something shifted in Patton. Up until this point, the war had been about defeating an enemy. Strategy. Movement. Victory. But now, it became something else. Accountability. Because just outside the camp was a town. Ordinary houses. Shops. Families. People who, at least on the surface, had been living normal lives. Close enough to see. Close enough to know. Or were they? That question hit Patton hard. Harder than anything he had seen on the battlefield. Because if they knew, what did that mean? And if they didn't, how could that be possible? His officers debated it quietly. Some believed the civilians had no idea. Others weren't so sure. The camp wasn't hidden in some remote wilderness. It was right there, within reach, within sight, within smell. And that's when Patton made a decision. A decision that would go beyond military orders. Beyond strategy. He turned to his men and gave a command that caught even his closest officers off guard. They were going to bring the townspeople in. All of them. Men, women, local officials. Anyone who claimed they didn't know. They were going to see it. With their own eyes. No excuses. No distance. No denial. But even as the order spread, there was hesitation. Not from Patton, but from everyone else. Because this wasn't typical. This wasn't how military operations worked. This was something else entirely. Something personal. And as soldiers began moving toward the town, knocking on doors, gathering civilians, explaining, sometimes forcing them to come. Tension began to build. The townspeople were confused, afraid. Some resisted. Some claimed ignorance. Others stayed silent. But one thing became clear very quickly. They had no idea what they were about to walk into, and neither did Patton's own men fully understand what this moment would turn into. Because once those civilians crossed the gates of that camp, nothing would be the same again, and what Patton was about to make them do next would spark a reaction no one could have predicted. The first group of civilians arrived under armed escort. They walked slowly, reluctantly, some whispering to each other, others refusing to speak at all. They had been told they needed to see something, that it was important, but no one explained what. Not fully, not yet. Patton stood near the entrance, watching them come in, studying their faces, looking for something, recognition, guilt, shock, anything. But what he saw instead was uncertainty, and that made things even more complicated. Because now the question wasn't just, did they know? It was, what happens if they didn't? Still, Patton didn't change course. If anything, he became more determined. He ordered his officers to guide the civilians through the camp. Show them everything. No shortcuts. No softening the reality. And that's when things started to unravel. At first, the civilians tried to maintain composure. They walked in small groups, avoided looking too closely, kept their distance. But the deeper they went, the harder that became. Conversations stopped. Footsteps slowed. Faces changed. Some turned pale. Others looked away completely. And then, a few began to break. Quietly, subtly. A hand over the mouth. A sudden pause. A refusal to go any further. But Patton had anticipated this. He didn't want a quick visit. He didn't want surface-level reactions. He wanted something deeper. Understanding. Acknowledgement. And maybe responsibility. So he gave another order. One that would take this from observation to participation. The civilians weren't just going to see the camp. They were going to help deal with what had been left behind. At first, the order didn't fully register, even among his own troops. But then it became clear. The civilians would be required to assist in burial efforts, to physically confront the aftermath, to take part in restoring dignity to those who had been left without it. And suddenly, everything changed, because this wasn't just about witnessing anymore. This was about involvement, direct, personal, unavoidable. The reaction was immediate. Some civilians protested. They claimed they had nothing to do with it, that they didn't know, that they shouldn't be forced into this. Others simply stood frozen, unable or unwilling to move. Patton didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of the order. And slowly, under pressure, under watch, under the reality of where they were, they began. Awkwardly at first. Hesitantly. As if each step required permission. But there was no turning back now. And as the hours passed, something shifted in the atmosphere. The distance between them and this place started to collapse. Because now they weren't outsiders looking in. They were part of it. Whether they accepted that or not. Soldiers watched closely. Some with approval. Others with discomfort. Because even among Patton's men, there was debate. Was this justice? Or something else? Was this necessary? Or too far? But Patton didn't explain himself. Not fully. Not yet. He moved through the camp, observing everything. The civilians, the soldiers, the reactions, taking it all in, as if he was measuring something that couldn't be easily defined. And then, late in the day, something unexpected happened. One of the civilians, an older man, well-dressed, clearly someone of status in the town, collapsed. Not from physical strain, but from what he had seen, or what he claimed he had never seen before. The moment froze everything. Work stopped. Conversations halted. All eyes turned toward Patton. Because now the situation had changed. This wasn't just a forced confrontation anymore. It was becoming something deeper, more volatile, more unpredictable. And the question hanging in the air was impossible to ignore. Had Patton just crossed a line? Or was this exactly the line that needed to be crossed? Because what he did next would not only define this moment, but would shape how history remembered it. By the time the sun began to set, the camp felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, just heavier, like the weight of what had happened there had finally settled onto everyone inside its fences. The civilians who had been brought in that morning were no longer the same people. You could see it in how they moved, how they avoided eye contact, how they no longer questioned why they were there. Because now they understood, at least part of it. But understanding came with a cost, and Patton knew that. He stood near the edge of the camp, watching as the last tasks of the day were carried out. His officers approached him carefully. There were concerns, not just logistical but ethical, political, even personal. Some worried about how this would be perceived. Forcing civilians into this kind of situation, it wasn't standard procedure. Others questioned whether it would have the intended effect at all. Would it lead to accountability, or just resentment? Patton listened, but he didn't immediately respond, because in his mind the decision had already been made. This wasn't about procedure. It wasn't about optics. It was about something much harder to define. Truth, and what people do when they can no longer look away from it. The next morning he made another move, one that surprised even those who had begun to understand his thinking. He ordered local leaders, officials, administrators, community figures, to return to the camp, not just to see it, but to document it, to write reports, to sign statements, to acknowledge in clear terms what had existed just outside their town. It wasn't enough to witness. They had to record it, to make it part of the official story. Because Patton believed something very simple. If it wasn't written down, it could be denied. And if it could be denied, it could happen again. But not everyone agreed with his approach. Some Allied commanders believed the focus should remain on military objectives. The war wasn't over yet. There were still battles to fight, territory to secure. Time spent on this was time not spent advancing. And yet, Patton didn't back down. Because to him, this was part of the war. Maybe the most important part. Not defeating an army, but confronting what that army had allowed or created. Word of what he had done began to spread. Among soldiers, among journalists, among higher command. Reactions were mixed. Some praised the decision. They saw it as necessary. A moment of forced awareness in a time when denial would have been easier. Others were more critical. They questioned whether it blurred the line between justice and humiliation, whether it imposed collective responsibility in a way that history might challenge. But on the ground, in that town, the impact was undeniable. The people who had walked through those gates didn't leave unchanged. Some spoke about it. Others refused to. Some tried to distance themselves. Others began to ask questions they had never asked before. And that was the part Patton cared about most. Not immediate agreement, not even acceptance, but disruption. The breaking of a narrative that allowed people to say, "We didn't know," because after that day, that claim became much harder to make. Years later, historians would look back on this moment and debate it. Was it justice? Was it symbolic? Was it effective? There's no simple answer. But there is one thing that stands out. Patton didn't just want victory on the battlefield. He wanted something that would last longer than that. A memory, a record, a confrontation that couldn't be undone. Because, in his view, winning the war meant more than stopping the fighting. It meant making sure the truth couldn't be buried along with everything else. And in that camp, on those days with those decisions, he made sure of one thing. No one who was there would ever be able to say they hadn't seen it,